Holy hell, how do you know that name? 8 words from a Columbus detective said this year, 20 years too late. A podcaster had just handed him a name across a desk, and his reaction told her something the police had never once admitted out loud. They'd been carrying that name the entire time. 2 decades, one name, and until this year, nobody on the outside knew it existed. Welcome. In this episode of Bad Things, we're going back to Columbus, Ohio, to the disappearance of Brian Shaffer, a case that has driven amateur sleuths and homicide detectives equally insane for 20 years. Because on the 20th anniversary, something finally moved. And to understand why 8 words from a detective matter so much, you need to understand how completely this man vanished. So let me set the table first. It's the night of March 31st, 2006. Brian Schaffer is 27 years old, a second-year medical student at Ohio State. On paper, he's the success story. Smart, charming, the guy everyone likes. But here's the thing people who knew him well will tell you. Medicine wasn't really his dream. It was his mom's dream for him. Brian wanted to play music. He had a Pearl Jam tattoo on his arm and a half-formed plan to start a band and put out a record, and somewhere on his old MySpace page, he'd basically written that med school was just a placeholder until the music thing happened. And 3 weeks before this night, his mother had died of cancer. So that's the emotional weather Brian's walking around in. Grief that's still raw, final exams that just wrapped, and the start of spring break, with a trip to Miami planned in a few days, with his girlfriend Alexis. The night before, he'd had dinner with his dad, Randy, at an Outback steakhouse. His father later said Brian looked wrecked, exhausted from cramming, and that some quiet part of him wished his son would just stay in and sleep. He didn't. Instead, Brian meets up with his former roommate, a guy named Clint Florence. Remember that name. The two of them go out drinking. They bar hop across Columbus, a shot of liquor at each stop, and they link up with a friend of Clint's named Meredith Reed. Around 1:15 in the morning, Meredith drives the three of them back to where the night started, a place called the Ugly Tuna Saloona, up on the second floor of a shopping and entertainment complex near campus. And we know they go back up, because the cameras catch them. There's footage of the three of them riding the escalator up towards the bar's entrance. Brian's right there. Once inside, Brian drifts away from Clint and Meredith. He mentions he wants to go see the band that's playing, a band he didn't actually know, which is its own little loose thread. Around 1:55 a.m., a camera films him just outside the bar's entrance, talking to 2 young women. He says goodbye to them. He turns. He walks back towards the doorway, which sits just out of the camera's view. That's it. That's the last verified image of Brian Shaffer that exists. At closing time, everyone files out. Clint and Meredith wait around, can't find Brian, call his phone, figure he caught a ride or wandered home, and leave. Nobody panics. Why would they? People lose each other at bars all the time. Except Brian doesn't go home. 2 days later, he misses his flight to Miami, and that's when the alarm goes up. And when police start pulling the thread, every detail makes it worse. His car is still parked at his apartment, 6 blocks away. His wallet's there. His phone, his credit cards, all left behind, or at least never touched again. From the moment he vanishes, not $1 moves, not one card swipes, nothing. He's a medical student in a major city in the 21st century, and he leaves a footprint the size of a ghost's. There is one strange electronic gasp. Months later, his phone briefly seems to ping a cell tower out in Hilliard, miles away, and at one point rings a few times when his girlfriend calls. The phone company writes it off as a glitch. To this day, nobody knows if that meant anything at all. So that's the puzzle. And it's worth being straight about, because this case has a myth attached to it, and if you've heard of Brian Schaffer, you've probably heard the myth that he vanished from a bar with only one exit, a sealed room, a magic trick. Here's the honest version. The lead investigator on this case, a man named John Hurst, who spent years on it, does not believe it was a sealed room. He thinks Brian walked out. There was a service exit toward a construction area, and the cameras covering that part were unreliable, the kind of system that overwrites itself. Hurst's own words this year: "Absolutely, he believes Brian left the bar. They searched everything. Crawl spaces, the roof, the whole building. Brian wasn't hiding inside. He got out somehow. We just can't see how." That's worth flagging now, at the top, because it matters for everything that comes next. The mystery isn't, how did he beat the cameras? The mystery is, once he stepped out of frame, where did he go? And who, if anyone, was waiting? Okay, the anniversary, the new lead. Let's get into it. Fast forward to early 2026. 20 years on, and this case has never really gone cold, in the cultural sense. There's a whole ecosystem of podcasters and researchers and Reddit threads keeping it warm. And two of the biggest players decide to mark the anniversary. The hugely popular show True Crime Garage runs a 6-part series on Brian. And a researcher named Kelly Kochenauer, who runs a project literally called Brian Shaffer, Dead or Alive, is working the case alongside them. Then they get a tip. Now, anyone who does this kind of work will tell you that 99% of tips are noise. Psychics, hunches. I saw a guy who looked like him at a gas station in 2011. You learn to let them wash over you, but the team publicly said this one was different. It was specific, it had a timeline, it had names. And here's the part that matters. It lined up with details they had deliberately held back from the public. The stuff you keep in your back pocket, exactly so you can test whether a tipster actually knows something. So Kochenauer takes the name from this tip, and she brings it to a Columbus detective. And that's the moment this video opened on. Holy hell, how do you know that name? Now there's context for it. Because here's what that reaction tells us. This was not some new suspect that fell out of the sky in 2026. This was a name the police already had. In fact, it gets better, or worse, depending on how you look at it. The detective reportedly said that this same name had been given to them once before, way back near the start of the investigation in 2006, by a friend of Brian's. So now you've got two separate people, years and years apart, with no obvious connection to each other, pointing at the same individual. That's not nothing. In a case with 1,000 dead-end tips, two independent fingers pointing the same direction is the kind of thing that makes a detective sit up. So who is it? And here's where it pays to be careful. The name has never been made public. Not by the podcasters, not by the police. This person has never been charged, never been publicly named a suspect. And as far as the law is concerned, they are an innocent person, and they're going to stay unnamed here because that's the right thing to do. So this is about what's been disclosed around them, not who they are. And what's been disclosed is, frankly, fascinating, because the 2026 coverage pulled back the curtain on stuff the public never knew. Remember that cell phone signal? It turns out that for about a month after Brian vanished, the phone company was able to roughly trace his phone bouncing between locations: North High Street, the Lane Avenue area, out toward Hilliard. The technology back then wasn't precise enough to pin a spot, but it gave investigators a rough map of where that phone had been. Now overlay that with where this person of interest lived in 2006. And here's the detail that changes the whole texture of this case. At some point, the reporting puts it around 2020, police got a judge to sign a search warrant, went to a house near Lane Avenue, and dug up the basement. They'd noticed a section of the concrete floor looked disturbed, patched, different. Think about what that means. A judge does not sign off on tearing up someone's basement floor because of a hunch. That warrant means that years after Brian disappeared, investigators had enough, a theory, an address, that phone data, to convince a court there might be a body under that concrete. And what did they find? An old fuel oil tank, capped off. No body, no sign that anyone had ever been buried there. The most promising physical lead in the entire case, and it dead ends in a rusted tank in the dark. So let's be clear about what the 2026 new lead actually is, because it's easy to oversell. It is not an arrest. It is not a body. It is not new forensic evidence. What it is a name, an old name, surfacing into public view for the first time, confirmed by a detective's startled reaction, and dragging with it the disclosure that police have quietly suspected something far more specific than they ever let on. For 20 years, the public story was, we have a few theories. The 2026 story is, they had an address, they had a warrant, they had a basement. Now, speculation time, because that's half of why we're all here. If you take the foul play road, the new lead fits a theory a lot of people in this community have held for years. That Brian never got far from that bar. That he walked out the back, into the night, and ran into the wrong person. Maybe somebody he knew, maybe an argument that got out of hand. And that he's been somewhere in Columbus this whole time. The lead detective himself now leans this way. His blunt assessment this year, it's been 20 years, Brian's probably dead, and it was probably foul play. And you can't talk about the foul play camp without talking about Clint Florence, the friend Brian was with all night. This part deserves a fair hand, because it's easy to be reckless here. The facts are these. Of everyone connected to that night, Clint is the one who declined to take a polygraph and brought in a lawyer. Brian's own brother has said over the years that he always felt something was off, that he believes Clint knows something he won't share. The father of Brian's girlfriend once said that every road to progress in this case seemed to run through Clint Florence. But, and this is a real but, refusing a polygraph is not a crime, and any decent attorney will tell you to refuse one because they're unreliable. Clint cooperated early, even did a TV interview. Meredith, who was with him, passed her polygraph and backs his account. The car they were in, the house they'd been staying at, all of it was forensically examined and came back clean. And in 20 years, the police have never once named him a suspect. So when you see people online treat him as the obvious villain, just remember, suspicion and proof are very different animals, and so far this is all the first one. Then there's the other road, the one that's quieter and somehow sadder. The possibility that there's no villain at all. That a grieving, exhausted young man who didn't really want the life he was living walked out of that bar and chose to disappear. Or walked out and met an accident in a dark construction site that simply never gave his body back. The people who knew him mostly reject the idea he'd run away. He had a Miami trip booked, a girlfriend he loved, plans. But grief is a strange country, and 27-year-olds carrying that much of it have made stranger exits. So here's where it all lands. Two strangers, decades apart, named the same man. A judge believed enough to open a basement, and the answer was an empty tank. So either the right name has been sitting in a case file for 20 years pointing at the wrong patch of concrete, or the right name has been sitting there pointing at the right person who simply put Brian somewhere they never thought to dig. And that's the thing about this case that won't let go of people. It's not that there are no answers. It's that the answers feel like they're right there, just on the other side of a doorway, just out of frame. Exactly where Brian was when the camera lost him.